Okay, to us and within the library.
To us and within the next line. Hi, Dolores. Hello, Kenneth Brown. Hi, Bonnie. And hi, Devora. Well, I'm glad to see you all here. I'm going to let you see me in just a minute. There I go. Okay, I hope my sound is good. Please let me know so I can adjust it. And hi, Sally Riley. Welcome to you. It's good. Okay. Well, that's good then. Then I'll go on. This is the fourth program in a series reviewing in depth the Green New Deal plan, okay, of Bernie Sanders. Hey, Matt Waldy, nice to see you here. And hi, Russell Coleman. It's nice to see you, okay, as well. So we've been through the first two segments of the Green New Deal plan, and now we're coming to the third and final segment. And the third and final segment is actually about ensuring rebuilding our economy and ensuring justice for frontline communities and for workers. And that is a very, very important part of the plan. Devora says now we have echoes. I'm not sure where they're coming from, but I'll try to moderate them. Okay, hopefully that helps a bit. Okay, do we still have echoes? So what I'm going to do now is share Bernie's plan with you. And I'm going to go over the third section and do a commentary on it. First, there's a paragraph. It's fairly short. It says, as we rapidly move towards renewable energy and energy efficiency, we must ensure that the workers employed in the fossil fuel industry see that their standards of living are not only protected but improved. So that sentence is an important sentence, okay, because he's not simply offering the negative of, okay, no harm is going to be done to you. He's also saying, with respect to your standard of living, we're going to improve it. And he says, a just transition for workers means guaranteeing the incomes, training, and pensions of affected workers, as well as major targeted investments that we're going to make in fossil fuel dependent communities. And then he claims the clean energy economy, which will create 3 times more jobs than we've been creating, I assume, and a full employment economy must also build strong unions, high wages, okay, and also benefits. And then the final sentence of that paragraph, which I think is very, very important again, is finally, the Green New Deal will redress historical injustices by tackling poverty, inequality, and the disproportionate impacts of environmental damage on poor neighborhoods, communities of color, First Nations, and on rural America. So, all of these communities are important to him, and he's promising justice here to the poor neighborhoods and communities of color, to the First Nations, and to rural Americans. He's recognizing that our rural Americans have had a raw deal over the last about 40 years or so, and he's proposing to redress that. So then he gets into workers. And of course, he refers to his history of fighting for workers since he's gotten into public life. And as he keeps saying when he's on the road, that he understands that coal miners and oil rig operators are not the problem. And of course, he praises the workers because they've powered our country for more than a century. He mentions the dangerous, okay, and precarious jobs they've had, but in order to provide for their families. And he recognizes that they've given their lives on unsafe, underregulated work sites, and in more recent years, they've seen their pensions get cut, their health care get stripped away, and their jobs disappear while the fossil fuel executives rake in billions. For too long, he says, this country has neglected workers displaced by the policy of the government. And then he refers to NAFTA and also the establishment of permanent, normal trade relations with China. And he notes that he opposed both of these things. He points out that these eliminated many millions of jobs and left entire communities devastated. And he says he will put workers first At full employment, economic opportunities and high wage jobs in underserved areas will be supplemented by income, healthcare, education, and pension protections. So that's part of the reason why he went to Kentucky over the weekend. It was not only to pressure Mitch McConnell, it was also to tell the workers there and to say to the coal miners there that they're going to be protected, that if he gets elected president, he's going to protect them. And he says, when we're in the White House, compensation and assistance for displaced workers will come first. The balance sheets of fossil fuel corporations and billionaire investors will come last. Now that's very direct speaking. Very direct speaking, or writing, as in this case. And Bernie says, as president, he will ensure a just transition for the energy workers. That's a bullet point, okay, in his plan. Okay, and he puts a monetary figure on what he's going to do for them. And he says he'll spend 1.3 trillion to ensure that workers in the fossil fuel and other carbon-intensive industries receive strong benefits, have a living wage, training, and placement in a job. And he says will protect the right of all workers to form a union without threats or intimidation from the management. And he says the benefits include up to 5 years of a wage guarantee and assistance with job replacement and relocation assistance and health care and a pension based on their previous salary. So people who are displaced are going to get up to 5 years protection to get into something different. If the workers would like to receive training for a different career path, they will receive either a 4-year college education or vocational job training with living expenses provided. So, if you're a displaced worker, you'll be able to go to college, get a college education, or get vocational job training, and in each instance, your living expenses will be provided. And he also says you'll also be eligible for health care, but through the Medicare for All plan. Remember, his Medicare for All plan specifies no premiums, no deductibles, and no copays, free at the point of service. It will save thousands of dollars for every family. Even when the displaced workers have good health care, even when they have pretty good health care from their unions now, that health care still costs a considerable amount. It is very likely that their expenditures, okay, for Medicare for All, even if they happen to be in a bracket which will be taxed, will be much less than what they're paying now. Then the plan says will fully fund tenant-based housing choice vouchers to ensure housing assistance to provide safe and affordable housing. Okay, and all this is under the general category of ensuring a just transition for the energy workers who were displaced by the transition to a Green New Deal. He goes further. If a worker is ready to retire, they may opt for pension support and access to health care through Medicare for All. And the final bullet point under this particular segment, currently the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund and multi-employer miners' pensions are paid by coal companies. And he says, we will protect the miners' pensions and provide $15 billion for the Black Lung Disability Fund to ensure it remains solvent as we transition away from coal. Okay, now Bernie's campaign and his experts have probably estimated at this point that $15 billion will be enough for that fund. But knowing Bernie, as we go forward, and if we continue to vote for him, if that fund is not enough, it's clear to me anyway, to this commentator, in any case, that there'll be as much in further new money that is needed to ensure that that fund will remain solvent until all of the eligible people have been able to access it, until the transition away from coal is completed. Because Bernie is very, very serious about this. He doesn't strike me as someone who will compromise on guarantees of justice for people. He will fight like hell to make that happen. And as long as you keep him in office and give him the wherewithal with support in Congress to do this, he won't compromise until it's done. Okay, next bullet point, require strong labor standards. He says all funding that flows from this plan should have the best labor standards attached. That means that all projects completed with funding from the Green New Deal will have fair, family-sustaining wages, local hiring preferences, but project, labor, and community agreements, including buying clean American construction materials and paying workers a living wage to the greatest extent but possible. Okay, so what's he saying there? There's going to be local hiring, and we're going to buy American to the greatest extent that we can. Wherever we can buy American, we're going to buy American. There are going to be preferences here for local hires in each of the areas where there are projects. And he says we will improve worker and fence line community safety standards at manufacturing and industrial plants. And finally, additionally, we will ensure that workers remain safe on the job by providing $100 million in funding for the Department of Labor's Susan Harwood training for high-risk industrial workers. That seems like a fairly small amount to me. I guess he's had some experts, who have estimated it. But I think that's another area that might get added to over time. I have no basis, okay, for evaluating how much would be necessary in this area. But I just have the intuitive feeling $100 million is too small an amount for that. Okay, just one person's opinion. Okay, next bullet point, he wants to provide employers with tax credits to incentivize hiring transitioning employees. He's doing this in order to ensure that workers who are displaced by this plan are able to find employment that is meaningful. And he's going to provide the work opportunity tax credit to employers who hire them. The next bullet point is going to invest in workers and in de-industrialized community economic but development. Now, many rural communities have been de-industrialized over a period of years now, over the last 40 years or so. So something has to be done. He says counties with more than 35 qualifying workers will be eligible. That's a pretty low number now. For targeted economic development funding to ensure job creation in the same communities that will feel the impact of the transition the most. And he says that funding will be distributed through an interagency effort spearheaded by, and he mentions a number of agencies here, so I'm not going to read through that. He points out that other projects that would be eligible for such funding include drinking and wastewater infrastructure, also broadband and electric grid infrastructure investments. And he says these targeted investments are intended to supplement, not supplant, infrastructure and economic development funding throughout the rest of this plan. So, what he's saying is, this is not all that's going to be done. This is in just this specific area to target investments to de-industrialized communities. Next bullet point, protecting the right of all workers to form a union without threat or intimidation from the management. Currently, the clean energy economy jobs are not yet as densely unionized as fossil fuel and building trades jobs. And he says, we plan to change that. Jobs created through this plan will be good wage union jobs. In order to do that, we must protect the right of all workers to form a union and collectively bargaining by passing Bernie's workplace democracy plan. And we'll be discussing his workplace democracy plan maybe tomorrow or maybe Wednesday. It depends upon how the rest of this stream actually goes. I'm not going to spend more than 45 minutes talking about this here tonight prior to the question period. So I should be through by 9:55. If I'm not through by 9:55, then part 4 will carry over to a part 5 tomorrow, which will then be the last part. But after we finish this, we're going right to his workplace democracy plan, which is a wonderful plan that is closely related to the Green New Deal. So we do have to go through that too. And he says, we will work with the trade union movement to establish a sectoral collective bargaining system that will work to set wages, benefits, and hours across entire industries, not just employer by employer. So, what he's saying there is that the federal government is going to work with the union movement as a whole to establish sector by sector standards. So the unions will not be left alone now to negotiate employer by employer. Yeah, they'll be able to do that as well, but they'll also have the support of the federal government in setting overall standards for a sector. Now that's going to be wonderful for unions. I'm not sure management is going to like it much, but it's going to be wonderful for unions. And he says that unions not only ensure that workers receive fair pay and benefits, they fight to ensure that workers, first responders, and fence line communities are safe and healthy. Then we go to his next section on economic development. And he says the plan will provide uh, actual targeted and regional economic development. And that communities, especially in need of assistance during our transition to a clean energy economy, will be eligible for additional funding for economic development investments through regional commissions and authorities. And he says, federal regional commissions make targeted economic developments investments in rural America. These commissions have funded projects that enhance workforce competitiveness, build and repair infrastructure, and increase community capacity like the broadband projects, clean drinking water, organic farming, and energy efficiency. And the plan calls for an additional $5.9 billion in funding to be distributed as follows. And then he gives the figures for each of the regional commissions in the United States. And also bullet points, infrastructure investments for impacted communities and outside of what looks like the roughly $6 billion that will go to the regional commissions and to the economic development assistance programs. With respect to infrastructure investments for communities that are impacted by climate change, he says, we will provide $130 billion for communities impacted by climate change, with funding for water, for broadband, and for the electrical grid. $130 billion. Now that is revenue sharing. Substantial revenue sharing by the federal government. Except it isn't really revenue sharing, but I don't want to go into why that's true here. But it's what was called revenue sharing back in the 1970s. The real thing about it is that the counties get money from the federal government, and they get $130 billion. So the next section is about a just transition for frontline communities. And he starts off here by saying there's no doubt poor, okay, and marginalized people suffer from the impacts of pollution and climate disruption, particularly communities of color. He says they're at the front lines of the climate emergency. For example, of the 73 waste burning incinerators across the United States, an astounding 79% are located within 3 miles of low income and minority neighborhoods, which are exposed to mercury, lead, and soot. He says the Green New Deal is not only a serious climate plan, but an opportunity to uproot historical injustices and inequities to advance social, racial, and economic justice, including excluding Black and Brown and Native American and other vulnerable communities from the programs that made up the original New Deal. Here, Bernie wants to right a historic wrong. One of the not so good things about the New Deal of the 1930s and the programs that went on in later years, but were originated in the New Deal. And then the plan says, as president, Bernie will, first bullet point, ensure an inclusive, comprehensive process from start to finish. He says, workers and communities on the front line of fossil fuel extraction, transportation, and use, and those most vulnerable to climate impacts must be involved from the creation and implementation of the regulations and protocols to the distribution of funds and carrying out the work of the Green New Deal. So he's saying the workers and the communities are going to have a voice, are going to have a say in the creation and the implementation of the regulations and the protocols. It's not going to be top down. It's going to be participatory in crafting the regulations and the protocols. That's so important for a democracy to have this kind of thing. And second bullet point: follow environmental justice principles. And he says it is an unfortunate reality that institutional racism also impacts environmental health and thus the public health and safety of millions of low-income families, people of color, and tribal communities. And he says African American and African American and Latinx communities deal with 56% and 63% more air pollution, respectively, than they create. Tribal lands are only 4% of the land base of the United States, yet a quarter of our nation's 1,322 Superfund hazardous waste sites, as well as the majority of our abandoned uranium mines, are in Indian country. Further, federal leasing of public lands for fossil fuels extraction significantly impacts numerous indigenous communities that share more than 3,000 miles of contiguous border with national forest lands. So that's what he means by frontline communities in part. they bear much more the burden of environmental pollution uh, on a proportionate basis than the rest of the United States does. So he says the Green New Deal must serve to address the modern and historical inequities and environmental racism. We will follow environmental justice principles and, a bullet point, ensure the full and equal enforcement of all environmental, civil rights, and public health laws, and aggressive prosecution of the violators. And he says the EPA's Office of Civil Rights will step up its investigations into alleged environmental justice violations, including corporate polluters, as well as the elected officials who enable them. So there are going to be investigations, and there are going to be penalties, and there are going to be jailings for people who enable pollution. So next, ensure that Green New Deal jobs and job training resources are made available to low income and disadvantaged communities equitably, and ensure equal access to clean energy, to electrification, efficiency, and transportation funding grants, okay, and other incentives. And he says, we will promote cleaner manufacturing and materials recycling, safe conditions for farm workers, and a clean energy economy while providing safe, healthy job sites, okay, and other economic benefits to people of color. And bullet point, he wants to focus job training and local hiring to reflect the racial and gender diversity of the community receiving federal investments. And he says that the federal procurement will prioritize minority and women owned businesses, cooperatives, and employee owned firms, and community owned and uh, community owned and the municipal enterprises. Notice he says the cooperatives. There's kind of a stream, okay, it's running through here that indicates that the Green New Deal will have a bias towards establishing cooperative businesses and other employee-owned firms. He says programs such as the historically underutilized by business zones will be expanded under the Green New Deal to promote job growth in economically distressed communities. Next bullet point. He wants to update the permitting rules that allow polluters to target poor communities for infrastructure that is polluting. He says the cumulative environmental impacts will be measured, and we will require polluters to basically fix the damages that they've caused. They're going to have to remediate the damage they've done. And then he says, our precaution for the health and safety of our children and our planet should be valued above profit. And that's also a stream that runs here. Profit is secondary to our children, to our planet, and to the public purpose. And he says, ensure that all agencies abide by Executive Order 12898, which, according to the EPA, requires agencies to identify and address the disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of their actions on minority and low income populations to the greatest extent practicable and permitted by law, uh, unquote. Uh, I'm sure he's very serious about that, and that the EPA is going to come to life under Bernie Sanders. If he has to drive every Trump civil service person and senior executive service person out of the EPA in order to get that done. He doesn't say that, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen in order to facilitate that. EPA is going to come alive again, and it's going to be very aggressive under a Sanders administration. Then he says, extend civil rights protections to ensure full access to the courts for poor and but also minority communities to seek legal protections by overturning the Sandoval court decision that set an unreasonable burden of proof for claims of environmental racism, including disparate and cumulative exposure to environmental health risks. So he's saying that there's going to be explicit legal protections that will be passed to overturn the Sandoval decision. He's saying that if the law is made more specific, they'll be able to overturn that particular decision. Next, he wants to follow the principles of environmental justice that were adopted at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And he says the goals and outcomes of the Green New Deal should continue to be developed under the GEMES principles for democratic organizing, with strong and consistent consultation with the communities most affected by the currently unequal enforcement of the environmental laws. So, okay, unfortunately, I don't know enough to say what the GEMES principles are, but I think you get the drift here. He's aligning himself with the findings the findings of the summit. And he's saying those principles are going to be made a part of the law. Further bullet point, ensure that funding from the Green New Deal for parks and public lands are distributed equitably in urban, suburban, and rural areas. And he says superfund hazardous waste sites should be fully fully remediated. In other words, fully fixed instead of simply covered up to make urban parks. So he doesn't want to cover them over. He wants to get rid of the hazardous wastes entirely. And there'll be funding for that that will be supplied in the Green New Deal. Next, he wants to fully survey and track the pollution in the vulnerable communities. He refers to the EPA EnviroScreen and says it will be enhanced in order to provide comprehensive information about the cumulative environmental impacts. The states are going to be required to report the progress made on environmental justice every 5 years. And he also says that the underrepresented communities will receive public education, technical assistance, and outreach as part of agency rulemakings and public commenting processes in order to elicit their participation in the rulemakings. In other words, he's going to create communities that are educated and that will be able to represent themselves in the rulemaking process. That is so very important. Next, he wants to promote urban sustainability initiatives to improve the environmental and social conditions of low-income neighborhoods and communities of color without rendering those neighborhoods inaccessible for future residents who are of limited economic means. So what he's saying there is he recognizes that in urban sustainability initiatives up until this time, when the environmental and social conditions of low-income neighborhoods and communities of color were improved, it often resulted in those neighborhoods being inaccessible for future residents who had low income. That's happened in many low-income neighborhoods in many of our the urban areas of the United States. The process is called gentrification. What he's saying here is the Green New Deal is not going to be dependent on gentrification of these neighborhoods. They're going to remain accessible to low-income people. And my next bullet point, ensure the creation and implementation of the Green New Deal is accessible to people with disabilities and non-English speakers. All publications will be in multiple languages, including Braille, and meetings will have language interpreters, including sign language as appropriate. Okay, so we're at 9:53 now, and we still have quite a ways to go. We have this section, which is on a just transition for frontline communities to finish. And then we also have a further section on empowering farmers, foresters, and ranchers. to address climate change and protect the ecosystems. Those sections are very, very important. And I will provide a commentary on them tomorrow, okay, at 9 p.m. And that will finish the Green New Deal plan. So you can tune in then, and we'll finish this. But now, what I want to do is to go over your comments and also to ask you, please, to share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com /Joe_Firestone. Okay, now I'll access Facebook and check out your comments. There I am. And so, Sally Riley said she doesn't have echoes. And Devorah says, yes, not super bad though, just makes you loud. Well, I was loud for part of this anyway, so maybe it was, just me being loud. And Rob Rivera's here. Hi, Rob. And Rob says, hey, Yoda. And Rob said, have you seen the latest polls? Bernie's in first. I saw the Monmouth poll and noticed that Bernie was in first, but also in a virtual tie with Elizabeth Warren, and Joe Biden was only a point behind. But Steve says, yep, Biden is crashing. Well, I'm not entirely sure that he's crashing yet, but I certainly think it's the beginning of the crash that we suspected was going to happen. We didn't think that he really would be able to carry a campaign, but through, in spite of all the money that he was getting. He doesn't seem to be able to handle the stresses anymore. He doesn't seem to be able to handle the debates. Steve says that it's Bernie Tulsi for 2020. Well, I think it's going to be up to Bernie. And I don't know exactly which way Bernie is going to go. And I don't think his thinking on that is really finalized yet. I think a lot is going to depend on how the race goes. Okay, and of course, if he wins, and if he should happen to win, how much support, okay, that Warren has in the country. Now, he seems to be personally close to Warren. He considers her a friend. I think he considers the Tulsi's a friend, okay, as well. But it's going to depend on what he thinks he needs in terms of the general. But Tulsi doesn't have near the support that he has among people. And Elizabeth Warren is developing a considerable base of support in the country. I think there's a good chance that the contest for the nomination on the Democratic side is going to become a two-person contest with Bernie, okay, and Warren. And if that contest is close and Warren is demonstrating a considerable amount of support, then I think Bernie will be hard pressed not to appoint her as the nominee for the vice presidency. Okay. Now, of course, he might just love to have Tulsi for her ability to reorient our foreign policy. But he might be able to have her too as Secretary of State. So if I was betting, I'd kind of bet here that probably Warren is going to be the vice presidential candidate, and maybe Tulsi would be appointed Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. Dale Weaver says, good evening, comrades. Hiya, Dale. Steve says, it's a beautiful vision of the future. Lana Dell is joined. And Steve Wolfbrand says, Bernie will need both houses and many more progressives in the Congress. Yes, he will. That's right. If he's going to get this done, he has to have what he needs in both houses, okay, of Congress. And not simply have a Democratic majority. He needs to have a lot more people who are progressive in both houses, okay, of Congress. Now, there's always a presidential party in Congress, and there will be one for him too. In other words, there are Congress people and there are senators who generally like to go along with the president of their party. They like to support the president, okay, of their party. And just as FDR had a presidential party, in spite of the fact that a lot of the people in Congress were a lot more conservative, okay, than he was, I think Bernie will have a presidential party. But apart from such a presidential party, he's really going to need a lot more progressives in Congress, both in the Senate and in the House, to back him up. And he's going to have a lot more people who are unreservedly progressive. And it'll be interesting to see if he can get that in the 2020 election, or if not in the 2020 election, in the 2022 election. Rob says, how can Bernie get rid of those corporate shills that have infiltrated all these important agencies like the EOA, the SEC, the FCC, and the FEC? I thought the civil servants would be protected. Yeah, civil servants are protected, but there are things that can be done to get civil servants to lead. Early retirement can be offered. People who are uncooperative can be broom closeted in the agencies, okay, in which they serve. Senior executive people are highly vulnerable to a change of administration. And the higher up you go in the senior executive service, the more vulnerable you are. Okay. Of course, it's going to be essential for Bernie, to get the political appointees that he wants in, and then to have those political appointees fill all the vacancies in the senior executive service with people who are loyal to Bernie's programs. But there's going to be a lot of pressure on senior executive service people and civil servants to fall into line. Now, generally, most civil servants will fall in line, okay, with any administration. They may not actively support an administration, but if they're opposed to the administration in principle, then those who are opposed will generally sit quietly and will not make a stir. And Rob says, typo, I meant EPA, not the EOA. Oh, great, Rob. Did you see the video, okay, of Elizabeth Warren laughing when she was asked about Bernie's Green New Deal? Yeah, I did see that, but I think if Bernie wins the presidency, she's going to stop laughing. In other words, I think if Bernie runs on that and comes out ahead, okay, in the primaries, I think she's going to stop laughing. I also think the changes in the weather and the changes in the climate that we're going to see over the next year or so, over the next year, okay, in 3 months, are likely to make her a believer, or at least make her stop laughing. And I see Thomas Gabriel Michel has joined. I think that might be the way to pronounce his name. And Rob says that would be a great job guarantee job to employ people on those educational public panels. That might be an official position that is outside of the job guarantee program. In other words, it might be a semi permanent position, okay, of one kind or another. Alan Scott has joined. And Steve Wolfbrand says, thanks, Dr. Joe. Well, thank you, Steve. And Russ says, I'm glad to see Bernie push the Overton window. Yeah, between this and the workplace democracy and the criminal justice reform, okay, and Medicare for all, and of course he's going to come out with his trade policies yet, I think, in some detail. He may not just be pushing the Overton window, he may be destroying the concept of the Overton window. Steve Wolfbrand is going to say, sadly, I doubt the deep state will allow Bernie to get away with this. But probably assassination, but we'll try. Well, I think Bernie's very smart as a politician. And he may not attack the deep state for a while. He'll have a lot of fish to fry here. And the deep state is very afraid of climate change. And they'll be happy about getting somebody in office who's really trying to do something about climate change. And a lot of the deep state operatives can be involved but by the administration in projects that are devoted to sequestering the carbon. So, and Russell asks, okay, is Liz moving to the right? Uh, I don't know if I'd say that she's moving to the right. What I'd say is she's a natural waffler. She's a natural waffler. She looks to see which way the wind is blowing. I mean, I tend to think that her preferences lean more to ourselves, but she's certainly very subject to pressures. She's subject to pressures from us, and she's subject to pressures from the right. So her mind is divided about which way she ought to go. Now, right now, the way the situation is shaping up in the Democratic Party, she can't match Bernie's fundraising from small donors. So she may want to inherit the big donor support that Joe Biden has. And so that's why we may see her making certain, shall we say, gestures to the right, sending certain signals that, well, she's going to be more reasonable than Bernie, so donate to her. Yeah, I think a lot of that is going to be going on. Steve says massive public support could advance Bernie's agenda like it did FDR's. I entirely agree with that, Steve. I think we can't underestimate the importance of the movements that Bernie is having behind him, and which will get larger and larger as his poll numbers continue to go up. His poll numbers continuing to go up will fuel further recruitment of the 1 million volunteer army. Oh, by the way, I heard a right winger who was on the Hill program today, who is extremely high level organizer for the Republican Party, okay, who was saying we have a vast ground game that we're continuing to deliberately finance. And then she said, our ground game is having 33,000 workers on the ground, as if that was the massive ground game. 33,000 workers. It's possible that in the end, Bernie will have 2 million workers in his ground game, not 33,000. And Lana says, Bernie says over and over that he will need us to stay in the game after he gets elected. I know he does. And he's going to have us stay in the game. He's not going to make the move, okay, that Obama did when he got into office. He basically disbanded, he disbanded Obama for America. Now, he patted us on the head and he said, okay, I don't need you now. He pushed people into passivity again. Bernie's not going to do that. He's going to whip up the movement. Those 1 million or 2 million or more people who volunteer for him for this campaign are going to be involved. As the government gets going with his program, as his executive orders come down, as his legislative programs come down, as they're passing through Congress. He's going to have millions of people out there campaigning on the issues for him. We will never have seen anything like it. We have to go back to the 1930s to see something that was even remotely like it. But what FDR relied upon, okay, during the 1930s, in large part, were unions, okay, and union organizing, okay, and union organizers. They were a big part of his movement, and they pushed him to do things. But of course, the unions will be coming back, and people will be volunteering for Bernie, who will be in back of a new organizing drive across the country. So, but simply apart from them, there will be millions of people who will be supporting him in this campaign, who will stay active when he gets into office, and will call Congress continuously, and will write, and will protest on the streets to get certain things passed. But the Sunrise Movement is not going to disband when the Green New Deal is passed. The Sunrise Movement is going to continue. The Extinction Rebellion is going to continue. All the different movements, the movement of movements in back of Bernie's campaign that's going to help to get him in, is going to keep on pushing him once he is in. Steve asked me, who do I think is going to benefit from Biden supporters when he crashes and burns, okay, as is inevitable? Thus far, the polling is showing that his supporters are moving equally between himself and Warren. At least the first group that actually defected from Biden. Some of the early polling, though, showed that he was likely to be the beneficiary of any Biden collapse. So we just have to see what happens. But right now, he is benefiting as much as Warren, or maybe a little more than Warren. Steve says, Liz imitates everything Bernie says. Now she's saying, not me, us. Yeah, I know, I saw that. I saw that she was saying, not me, us. And she should say, not me, us. And it's a good thing if she comes to rely on the idea, okay, of not me, us. Because if that's the case, then we're going to be part of the us. And she's going to have to go along. Russ says, it's the younger generation that is mobilizing for Bernie. You bet. It's the younger generation that's mobilizing for Medicare for all, and for a Green New Deal, and for a better economy, and for a job guarantee, and for the whole ball of wax. They're mobilizing to really make America great again. Except it's not actually making America great again. It may be making America great for the first time. And Steve says, FDR did fireside chats. I suspect Bernie might do something like that as well. If you remember, Jimmy Carter did something similar to fireside chats, okay, as well. In fact, as I recall, he was wearing a cardigan sweater at the time because he wanted people to turn down their thermostats. And Steve says the DSA will continue to. Yes, it will continue as well. And the DSA will grow throughout a Bernie election. The Democratic Socialists of America will grow. And they'll be supporting certain candidates that will be running this time. And so their membership is going to grow. I think in 2020 it's likely to double again. And at the end of that period to be 120,000 strong. I think they're around 60,000 right now. But this country needs the Democratic Socialists to be strong. We need it badly. Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, so I'll show you this screen one more time. Please share, like, and subscribe, and please become a patron. And then I'll check in with you again and see. Lana said good night. And Steve said, you do indeed go deep. I always try to go deep, Steve. I guess that's my thing. I like to go deep as much as I can. So, anyway, thank you all for coming. And thank you all for the hearts and the stars and the explosions and all the other nice things that one gets on Facebook. And I will see you tomorrow night in roughly the 9 o'clock time frame, and we'll finish up about Bernie's New Deal then. And on Wednesday, we'll move on to the workplace democracy plan. What a wonderful thing. What a wonderful thing. So thank you all for coming.